Okay, I think we can start. I'm very happy to welcome you. And we are here and in the meeting, realizing the localization agenda, promising practices from development agency to lift up philanthropy and achieve the SDGs. This meeting is hosted by Wings and supported by the European Union. And the meeting is under the United Nations High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development. It's one of the side event. So we are very, very glad to have you here. My colleague is now sharing with you some simple rules that you will find in the chart. I will show you our agenda, that it's important to have an idea about what we are going to do today. You should see my screen, and I will I'll just introduce you a few words on the plan of the day. We will start with welcome and introduction with the first panel, following a keynote speech. And then we have a second panel where we discuss with some example and some practices from the different agency. Finally, we will have a plenary discussion when everybody is present here who can join, is invited to join. And finally, we are going to the conclusions. We have a lot to say today. It's quite dense meeting. So I'm happy to just start and introduce the first panelists, Benjamin Belgi, our executive director of Wings. They will also introduce a bit the goals of this event and the history, why we are here and why Wings invest energy and is try to promote the local ecosystem inside the localization debate. So Benjamin, I'm happy to leave you the floor.
Thank you very much, Tiziano, and welcome to everyone. I'm sorry if I look a little bit dark. I'm in Asia right now. It's night, and that's the best setting I could find. So apologies for that, but I hope you can hear me well. And it's a great pleasure to be with you, and it's a privilege to have such great speakers with us today and such a diverse audience of practitioners from development banks, development agencies, and a few foundations as well, who are interested in how philanthropy can contribute to the localization agenda. This meeting that we're having today is very important because we don't want this to be just about speaking and talking, but really about action and how private players like philanthropic actors, foundations can help move the needle on localization. We know that this is a topic that has had a lot of attention, a lot of discussions, a lot of maybe research, but little action. And even in some cases, we saw that we did not, we even lost a little bit of the funds that were going locally to local organizations for the SDGs, and it's really something we need to work on very urgently as we're recovering from COVID-19 and as we are trying to achieve the SDGs with such a short time in such a challenging context. And so today, really, the objective is for a specific group of players who are working in development agencies, multilateral organizations, to see how they can engage with philanthropy, but also how they can support philanthropy and the growth of philanthropy, and also stronger foundations locally to help localize resources. That's a little bit the framing that we invite you to follow today, is that the idea is that to localize aid processes and aid development, we don't need only to send international resources to local actors, which is critical, but also to help localize resources for local actors. And that's where there is really an opportunity to strengthen local ecosystems, community foundations, crowdfunding platforms, and other networks that can help harness the power of giving and the power of private social investment in different forms and coming from different parts of society. So that's what we will explore today, and we want to see what's the role of development agencies to support the growth of this ecosystem, and how that can be done intentionally. So this meeting today is a follow-up to a previous meeting we had about a year ago at the previous UNGA. We had some of the speakers that are with us today as well. But it was a meeting that was more diverse in terms of audience. We had, of course, foundations, we had civil society organizations, development agencies, and other types of actors. But we felt like after this first really important exchange and strong interest that we raised with this first meeting, we thought it was important to deep dive into the issue with specific group of actors. So that's why Wings, who is a network of organizations to support the growth of philanthropy around the world, to support a stronger ecosystem for effective philanthropy around the world, that we're trying here to create this discussion with you, to create a group of champions of practitioners from development agencies and multilateral banks that can help create stronger ecosystems locally and help localize also resources for local development. So that's what I wanted to mention very briefly as a few opening thoughts. And I will now invite Chiara Adamo from the European Union, who is our partner in this event, but also our partner more broadly in elevating the voice of philanthropy in terms of creating a strong enabling environment for the field, a strong ecosystem for the field also locally in low and middle income countries, to introduce also the event and to share her thoughts with us. So Chiara, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Benjamin, and welcome everyone. Really grateful you are taking part in this event today. The event today is important and the topic is extremely important to us. And I will start by illustrating very briefly why. And the reason is simply democracy, human rights, and the rule of law are under severe stress in many countries across the world. 1/3 of the world population now live in countries undergoing autocratization, and nearly 3/4 of countries recorded a decline in overall rule of law performance this year in 2001, since 2001, and this continue a long-running trend. The triple crisis of COVID, climate, conflict, and I would also add a 4C, the cost of living, against the background of the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine and its impact, also beyond Europe, make it even more urgent and important that we really address people's aspiration and need concretely by taking a human rights approach, which means listening to local actors, co-creating solutions adapted to local contexts with the protagonists there. And that's why localization is such an important element of all this, and where domestic philanthropy comes in. This is gaining traction, and boosting the development of domestic philanthropy in partner countries can really increase inclusivity, development effectiveness of the networked philanthropic sector, which is very diverse, ranging from local community initiatives to individuals, family business, charities, to big philanthropic networks and larger global foundations. So local civil society organizations, of course, by definition, know best the local context. They enjoy the trust and engage directly with communities they serve, and that's what makes them really ideal partner to deliver development projects. However, few of these organizations receive the kind of investment that can really help them to plan in the long term and in a sustainable way. Hence, alternative financing approaches that accelerate localization, inspire, incentivize change, and address community needs must be encouraged. And that's a long introduction to explain why we are so pleased to work with Wings and its networks of associations and foundations to promote philanthropy role as really active players in development and for achieving the Agenda 2030. I'm also happy to inform that we are in the process of forging a more long-term partnership with Wings at the level of the European Commission through a framework partnership agreement. And its aim will really be to leverage philanthropy engagement, funding, influence, and added value to implement the 2030 agenda. And it will contain an important component on localizations in partner countries. As for what we do with the CSO sector, this activity will mainly concentrate on promoting an enabling environment, or in other words, promoting an ecosystem of foundations in our partner countries. And the idea is really to analyze and improve the condition in which foundations in partner countries work, be it legal conditions or more operational impediments or others. More diverse and effective philanthropy means more resources. It also means more support to those at the forefront of social change, as I was mentioning. So community philanthropy really also entails to build this ecosystem, which would be able to then grow and replicate itself in new setting. From our part, the European Union remains a strong defender of human rights and democracy. This is already illustrated by Walking the Talk, the UN member states, our Team Europe. We represent, I believe, the biggest donor of democracy support in the world. And in this context, just a last reference to the launch of our Global Team Europe initiative on democracy support, which enables us to work with 14 of our countries, but very importantly with like-minded, with partners, with CSOs and foundations to focus efforts on the grounds in countries on a number of issues, including countering authoritarianism and fighting corruption, promoting an enabling environment for pluralistic media and civil society, and last but not least, civic political participation of women and youth. With that, I really wish you a successful discussion, and I look forward to the exchange.
Thank you a lot, Benjamin, and thank you a lot, Chiara. I take the opportunity to thank the European Union. Thank you, Chiara, because I mean, your support for Wings and in general for Philanthropy, it's a game changer in the development of the local ecosystem. So this is what we are doing. It's our partnership is really crucial for the work that we are doing for localization. And I'm sure that Andrew Chuninal will agree with me in this observation. Andrew is our board chair in Wings, but he's also the CEO of the Community Foundation of Canada. So Andrew, the floor is yours to continue the conversation.
Thank you, Tiziano. And you know that I always agree with you. I make it a habit to. And I appreciate the stage setting by Benjamin and Chiara. That was very well done. Perhaps I can build off that through some observations after being here in New York City at the United Nations over the past few days with colleagues. Certainly no one thought about how the incredible shocks of the pandemic would affect the world and the pace of development that we had originally aspired to in the Sustainable Development Goals and in achieving Agenda 2030. Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, opened up the high-level political forum this week, and he described to the plenary the mounting setbacks to build back better from the pandemic as development and movement towards these goals has undeniably slowed down. The Secretary General said the world is progressing at only a quarter of the rate needed to achieve the Agenda 2030. Well, 2030. And it's not called Agenda 2060 because the world cannot wait decades longer. I'm certainly honored to be here in New York City at the United Nations, listening to government delegations, technical development experts, hearing amazing stories and positive experiences about investing in innovators and digital technologies. I've heard from government after government called for trust-based multi-stakeholder partnerships that create local buy-in, local knowledge, and encourages sustainability of actions. To me, the answer to how to localize these efforts, the impact and the approaches must clearly put local actors at the center. This includes, of course, those working to make philanthropy more effective and promote giving, a culture of giving. Support organizations are mobilizers of sustainable local development. The pandemic has exposed the gaps in global emergency systems that exist, and philanthropy networks have been supporting both being the immediate and long-term response. As CEO of Community Foundations of Canada, I'm glad to share that in Canada, we mobilized 350 million Canadian dollars for community organizations to serve vulnerable Canadians during the COVID-19 crisis. My colleagues from all over the world have been implementing very similar efforts. Today's topic is localization and localizing provision of resources, both financial and political support, to build local ownership in development efforts and shift the power to promote self-guided leadership, project design, and implementation by national and local civil society. This short time for this thoughtful exchange with you, the development experts at the international level, can help us better understand and share experiences and promising practices in creating the conditions for philanthropy to be a valued partner in this endeavor. We are here to take a deep dive into the multi-stakeholder approach and the innovations that local philanthropy could bring if given a conducive ecosystem and enabling policy environment. I have the fortunate opportunity to now turn the floor over to our keynote speaker, Ms. Michelle Sumales, the Assistant to the Administrator of U.S. Aid Policy. Michelle, thanks for being here and happy to turn the floor over to you now.
Good morning, everybody. It is really great to be here, and I am very happy to have been able to join Wings and the community here to talk about localization several times over the last couple of months. I just want to also congratulate Wings and those who wrote the policy paper on localization that we'll be discussing today. There are many good recommendations in that paper, and we are very excited to work with you and our European Union colleagues and others on the line to really move this agenda forward. We really also just want to thank Benjamin for all of his work and for holding this event on the sidelines of HLPF. And also look forward to hearing from our Dutch, our French, and our Swiss colleagues on the panel going forward. The development and humanitarian challenges that we're facing today, from poverty to food insecurity to lack of access to basic health and social services, climate change, migration, and I could go on, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention COVID. As others have, they're so widespread, complex, and interrelated, and they're even further exacerbated by the Russian war in Ukraine. But ultimately, we cannot forget the fact that they are fundamentally local challenges. And local communities, local civil society, local philanthropy, local innovators need to be at the center of our work. It is true that we're facing headwinds to achieving the SDGs. It makes me very, very sad. But I do think that we need to redouble our efforts and invest in what works. The challenges facing us and the vision of the SDGs, they're far-reaching, they're global, they're inspirational, and we should not allow the challenges of today to make us feel down on those issues. So what we want to make sure as we try to come up with new and different, or just expand existing interventions that are working, is that we are looking at the lived experiences of those who are facing these local challenges to make sure that those are the things we're lifting up, that we're listening to, that we're seeing make a difference. So we want to make sure that any solutions that our community at USAID undertakes are built upon the aspirations and expertise of the people who live with these issues every day. Local communities know their own challenges, and when we shift more leadership, ownership, decision-making, evaluation, and implementation to the local communities and institutions, results are likely to be sustained by local organizations and institutions using their own resources, their own ingenuity and abilities going into the future. I saw this just last month when I was in Kenya for over a week, meeting with local communities, government, civil society, and other private sector partners who are really working on new ways of doing development work that work in their communities. What works in Nairobi does not work in the Mara, it does not work in other regions of the country. USAID's not new to this focus and to this work, but we do have a renewed effort because of the call from our administrator to focus on this. We're looking at how to make a more effective use of our resources and our investments, and we're looking to centralize localization in all of our work. It will not be a side project for USAID, but rather it will be central to how we do all of our programming, from development work to global health, to health work, to climate change work, to humanitarian assistance. And we hope that people may have been hearing about this work, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it going forward. Administrator Power, as I mentioned, she challenged us in November of 2021 to really take this on and to implement a localization agenda and to increase our funding to local actors to 25% of our overall resources over the next 4 years, and building local voice into 50% of all of our programs over the next decade. To advance this bold vision of inclusive development, USAID is reevaluating our core business processes, our staffing, our skill sets, our priorities, so we can bolster these efforts. We have spent the last 6 months looking at every bureaucratic tool that we have, from our agency risk assessment statement to our acquisitions and assistance strategies to our tools, our grant and contract tools, to see how we can make them more accessible for local partners. As I mentioned, I just returned from Kenya, and I saw firsthand how this has been implemented through a PEPFAR program in the Dandora neighborhood of Nairobi, where many young women are at high risk of gender-based violence, HIV/AIDS, and other challenges. At that site visit, I learned that more than 85% of USAID's PEPFAR funding in Kenya is now channeled directly to local organizations. And I was just so overwhelmed by the aspirations of 3 young women who I met there, who were becoming leaders in their local communities because of these efforts, because of the mentoring they're receiving from local women in the community. We really believe that this empowerment of local partners creates a new and deeper trust between us, the USAID, between the US government, those communities that we're working in, and the programs that we're supporting and the people they serve. In addition, earlier this year, with support that just came from our US Congress as well, USAID launched Central America Locale, which will allocate $300 million over the next 5 years to activities to engage local organizations and foster locally led development solutions to irregular migration from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. This is another powerful example of what it looks like to invest in locally led development. It's an example of where our missions are thinking differently of how they engage with local communities. It's an example of where we're hiring new and additional staff to support these initiatives, specifically Foreign Service nationals who are local community members to work with us. In addition, through our Local Works initiative, which operates in 35 countries around the world, it provides an example for us of how this looks in practice. It provides flexible funding, and just last week, our administrator announced that we'll be investing $3 million in Zambia to support locally led development there. We are working, as I said, also in humanitarian situations where we're working, for example, in Bangladesh, where there are nearly 1 million refugees resulting from the Rohingya humanitarian crisis. And in that community, we're working in the district of Cox's Bazar to support their local community work to adapt to the climate change disasters and cultivate alternative livelihoods in those communities. This is a program through Local Works, and we are working to expand that kind of intervention through our regular humanitarian assistance funding. These examples and many, many more, which we'll be highlighting over the next 6 to 12 months, show how our programming is shifting, how we're trying to empower our local communities to take the lead, how we're trying to step aside. But however, we don't think it's going to be enough for local partners to win grants and contracts. So we want to work on how we fundamentally shift the power dynamic. And that is why we also believe that local philanthropic efforts are so important. We want to be supporting local funding ecosystems to be able to develop and reach out to their local communities and support what's going on. We want to support the business environment to make this possible. We want to work and think about how government regulations needs to be changed so that local philanthropy can stand aside global philanthropy and with governments and donors together to make this possible. The local philanthropy effort brings a unique capacity to respond to these local priorities, and we believe that a robust local philanthropic ecosystem is what allows that local investment to transform into sustained results alongside all the civil society and private sector efforts that are there. So we are looking to work with you and many others to help us see what the next step should be. Doing all of this will require a serious commitment to learning on our parts. And for example, I just want to say when USAID sought to change how we supported the NGO sector in Serbia, we realized we needed to understand the current state of giving, the challenges and the legal and cultural barriers that inhibited the local philanthropic ecosystem. So in April of 2018, we launched the Framework for Giving program in partnership with the Ana and Veled Devac Foundation and several other partners that ran until January of this year, which focused on deepening cross-sector partnerships, improving the legal and policy framework to make giving more easier and transparent, and increasing public awareness of philanthropy efforts in Serbia. What we saw in Serbia was the beginning of a shift to a more locally led and responsive philanthropic ecosystem. And as a result of this program, there's now a National Day of Giving that highlights the importance and impact of philanthropy. The government has formed a council for philanthropy, which then got to work by developing working groups to examine the legal framework for food surplus donations, corporate giving, individual giving, and criteria for VAT relief for individual donations. In addition to these developments, we saw the launch of tools that connected citizens and charities, analyses of public opinion on philanthropy, and new awards to recognize philanthropy in their own communities. So we hope that we can leverage these kinds of partnerships to meet the challenges of the SDGs. Where strong local funding ecosystems exist, we collaborate closely with them to guide how we direct our funding. And where they're still in development or need to be assisted because of market conditions or government regulations, we look forward to working alongside key stakeholders to foster and unleash the power of local funders. I want to close by just saying thank you so much to Wings for hosting this event, bringing these issues to the HLPF, and bringing us all together. USAID looks forward to working with all of you as we commit to this new vision, or this enhanced vision of localization. It delegates power to those closest to the challenges. Thanks so much.
Thank you a lot, Michelle, for your speech. I mean, it's you gave a lot of concrete examples that what we want to have in this meeting. I mean, we want to go towards concrete, clear approaches that we can use and we can learn from. So that's very important for us. Second point that I think you underlined is very important, that it's not enough. So this is an invitation for everybody here in this room that we need to increase that. And third point, you mentioned also our policy paper, and we will be happy to discuss it now. As you can see, one of our guests, Tony Pippa, apologized, but he cannot be with us today for healthy reasons. So we have best wishes to him. But we are lucky that our colleague, Casey Kelso, that was a senior manager in different organizations, among them Transparency International and the International Crisis Group, and above all now, senior advocacy officer for Wings, and the author of the policy paper that Michelle mentioned. So I'm very happy to give the floor to Casey that can help us a bit to go in continuation of what Michelle said and even illustrate the key points of the policy paper.
Thank you, Tiziano. Thank you for the introduction. I wouldn't have told anyone that I was the author of the paper, because all the blame, if you find faults, then you can blame me, and if you find it good, then it's the rest of Wings that actually consulted and made it what it was. Thank you so much, Michelle, too. That was wonderful to hear. We appreciate you joining us, and it was wonderful to hear some of the different examples from USAID's work, the PEPFAR funding in Kenya, or the Central America project, the Local Works Initiative, or Cox's Bazaar, or the Serbia, the National Day of Giving. I wanted to, before you go, I know you have to leave us fairly soon, but I wanted to ask, how can you replicate those examples? Is there anything that you're in reviewing and looking at how over the last 6 months of trying to change the contracts or risk assessments, as you mentioned, is there any way to scale those up and replicate those on a larger platform for trying to influence the local funding ecosystem?
Casey, thank you for the question, and thanks everyone for all the kind comments. Look forward to the panel What I will say is that USAID will be launching in the next month or so, internal to all of us, and hopefully some of it will be external in time, a localization playbook, which will provide tools to all of our missions and all of our staff around the world on what has worked, how to access new and different things. There'll be new trainings for required trainings for parts of our team. And so we are working very closely to make sure that we're actually supporting peer-to-peer learning within USAID to make sure that all of our foreign service nationals and our foreign service officers in the field, as well as everyone in Washington, are working together to really move this agenda forward. In addition, many of you and many of the donors on the phone here with us have been part of efforts at the OECD DAC to really talk about how we can take our lessons learned in our countries as donors to each other. And so we will be facilitating and supporting a conversation at the DAC in the coming year on this issue as well. So we're trying to work across the donor community to support this conversation, as well as across and inside USAID to support scaling up of these efforts. So stay tuned for hopefully some very exciting announcements and efforts.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that answer. That will be interesting to watch the DAC conversations then. That seems to be a place of great innovation among the internationals. And thank you again for making that link between localization and the SDGs with a multi-stakeholder approach, trying to think more about how is philanthropy playing its role. Question then is, I think Tiziano had referred to it, is that we have made a policy paper. I think, Bia, I'm not sure if you put it into the chat or not, but the policy paper is out there as a foundation or as a background to today's discussion. That policy paper does a few things. It defines terms, shift the power, what is local, which has been a headache of sorts, I know, with USAID and others, of what defines a local agency or a local organization. It lays out the argument of philanthropy as an actor in successful localization and discusses some of the challenges and approaches in implementing that empowerment, whether it's direct funding of local CSOs or other ways in which you try to simplify the way that you get direct funding down there, or some of the non-financial, some of the political capital that needs to be put into the whole discussion as well. Finally, as you mentioned, as Michelle mentioned, it's also a question of some of the recommendations that have come up. We had 3 for development agencies, and one of them was supporting initiatives for enabling environment for philanthropy and civil society. We see them as quite closely tied together, that civil society space, but also an enabling environment for philanthropy. The second was more on promoting learning and sharing of best practices, trying to make sure that exchanges like this continue. And the third was generating that giving infrastructure, supporting local funding, fundraising in country for civil society that continues even after international aid ends. So it was one of the 3 recommendations that sort of formed the backdrop. We want to now go to some of the other colleagues that have been listening for their perspectives as well. The presentation, I'd like to present each of the panelists with a caveat that they're going to be looking at concrete examples or situations, case studies that, such as Michelle has mentioned as well. And so there's a lot of learning out there that needs to be done. I'll try to be a little bit tough on each of the speakers, the 2 speakers that we have, but we have first up was Reinier. Reinier van Hoffen is a senior policy officer with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Netherlands, and he leads on knowledge development and learning in the strengthening civil society policy framework. That is the one that was mentioned last year by Kitty van Heijden, as a budget of 1.5 billion over the next 5 years, which is no small money, and has different programs like the Power of Voices, a Giving for Change Alliance that's talking about mobilizing domestic resources. So we're looking forward to hear from you, Ryan. Go ahead, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Casey. Thank you for that kind introduction. And indeed, last year, Kitty was with you and related some of the information that I will also share with you again, just as a reminder. But apologies from her end that she couldn't make it today. So I'll try to be a good replacement. I'd like to thank you for inviting the Netherlands to this important, though unofficial, virtual side event on localization at the high-level political forum on sustainable development. The Netherlands finds it crucial to address fundamental inequalities in the development cooperation system in our own and all societies and working environments. We need to do better and recognize the reservoir of knowledge of those intimately involved in the settings on the ground. We need to fundamentally assess whether our programs are actually addressing the most important needs, which is why the Netherlands considers local ownership vital for sustainable development. More ownership for local organizations is one of the core elements in the mentioned policy framework, strengthening civil society. The worrying trend towards increased restrictions of civic space and restricting foreign funding in many countries means that it is pivotal that our efforts to foster local ownership go hand in hand with efforts to protect and enhance civic space. The Netherlands fosters local ownership in its strengthening civil society strategic partnerships with CSOs. In our policy, we enter as a strategic partner in consortium with both Northern and Southern-led CSOs and consider decision-making processes on all steps, visions, programming, funding. It's all a joint responsibility. 58% of our NGO alliance partners are currently partners from the Global South. Furthermore, the percentage of organizations from the Global South that are in the lead within the alliances doubled from 6 to 12% as compared to our previous policy framework dialogue and dissent that ran from 2016 to 2020. We recognize that we can always do better. We therefore create spaces for exchange through learning events, dialogue sessions, hosting thematic learning events, etc., where we involve partners, both from Global North and Global South organizations. Additionally, we launched a Strengthening Civil Society Learning Tender in March 2022, March this year, for a learning and research program, including learning about locally led development and Southern leadership. That must lead to a high quality facilitation of learning and knowledge management that, importantly, taps both local academic discourse and also feeds it, as well as tacit knowledge within society, within NGOs, within the philanthropic community. We have various instruments that directly fund local and Southern-based civil society organizations. For example, the Leading from the South Fund, which is a feminist philanthropic fund and alliance conceptualized and managed by 4 leading Global South women's funds. Leading from the South supports women's rights organizations in their activism and lobbying efforts. It supports movements, networks, national and grassroots level organizations in the Global South. Another example is Voice, which is an innovative grant facility, 86 million fund for 8 years, 2016 to 2024, led by 2 of our international NGOs, Oxfam Novib and HIVOS. It supports rights holders and groups facing marginalization or discrimination in their efforts to exert influence and access productive and social services and political participation. Voice has proven to bring the principles leave no one behind and nothing about us without us into practice by directly funding local Southern and target group-led organizations in 10 countries in Africa and Asia. Likewise, also our embassies, our missions have the opportunity to offer direct support to local CSOs. This direct support strengthens local ownership and Southern leadership, and also mutual learning. The Netherlands, in partnership with a consortium of 4 organizations, including the Africa Philanthropic Network, Kenya Community Development Foundation, Wilde Gansen, as already mentioned by Casey, and Global Fund for Community Foundations, constitute the Giving for Change Alliance, which is a 5-year, 24 million program, one of the programs under Power of Voices that invests in community philanthropy development in 8 countries, in Brazil, Burkina Faso, Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, Mozambique, Palestine, and Uganda. Giving for Change is part of our Power of Voices program, and its aim is to foster local giving as an expression of voice, an expression of civic participation, an expression of solidarity, or at times an expression of dissent. The program builds evidence around new thinking, approaches, and leadership that support community philanthropy. It promotes community philanthropy as a strategy for achieving community-led development by increasing local ownership, buy-in, and claiming of rights, and by challenging the notion that development is something that is done to communities by external actors. Against the global background of shrinking civic space, Giving for Change will encourage civil society organizations, including and especially human rights organizations, to value and adopt local resource mobilization as a form of constituency building and as a way to strengthen their position as legitimate champions and defenders of diverse causes with strong roots in the communities they serve. Finally, the Netherlands is very vocal about the importance of local ownership. As already alluded to, we played an active role in the adoption of the OECD DAC recommendation on enabling civil society as a co-chair and member of the Community of Practice on Civil Society. Local leadership is a key priority within this recommendation, to which all DAC members have committed themselves. It is vital that we take this opportunity to step up our game as donor community, learn from each other, and seek coherence to lower administrative thresholds that impede Southern leadership. Lastly, our recent policy note on foreign trade and development cooperation, entitled "Doing What the Netherlands is Good At," also testifies of the continued support to civil society strengthening. That's what we're good at as well. More equal partnerships, improved access for local civil society organizations to funding instruments like Power of Voices is a clear ambition that has been articulated in this policy note written by our new Minister of Development Cooperation and Trade. On her behalf, I'd like to thank you for having us and looking forward to our conversation.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Reinier. That was useful to have that reminder of the need to do better, particularly with the worrying trends that are there, like Chiara Adamo had mentioned on the creeping autocratization and pushback, I guess, against democracy. So it's nice to have that idea of a leading from the South and having a leading from the South program led by women leaders themselves. Just to note that Africa Philanthropy Network is actually a Wings member as well. So fostering giving as a local voice is part of the, not just solidarity, but also working and networking, trying to learn across our network. I'd like to then turn the floor over to Anne de Soucy. She's the Director of Partnerships at the French Development Bank, Agence Française de Développement, and has a lot to share actually on her side. Anne, over to you.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much, Casey. Thank you to all of you. I'm really very, very happy to take part to this panel. AFD has been regularly invited to your discussion, but it's the first time that we have the honor to be a panelist, so I can feel the pressure on my shoulders from colleagues behind. But no, seriously, I believe you just picked the right subject, the issue of localization, which is particularly relevant to all of our institutions and really fits perfectly also in the current French agenda and in the actions implemented by AFD. As we are the French Development Agency, my ministry will check if I mention also what the French government has done on this issue. And we have to say we're very happy because the France adopted a new law last year on inclusive development and fight against poverty to support our trajectory towards the 0.7% aid target, which is an ambition supported by our President Macron. And this law sets 3 goals for the French ODA: the fight against poverty, the promotion of human rights, the protection of global public goods, and puts a very strong emphasis on localization. And I think it's relatively new in our vocabulary and in our methods of working. The idea is really to, the objective, the target is to double the financing of civil society, to enhance the financing and the cooperation with philanthropists. So we're really right in the middle of the subject. A few months earlier, in May 21, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs adopted a strategy on philanthropy and development, which was also a new topic for them, in order to encourage a bigger contribution of French foundations to support development projects in ODA countries. I'm not very proud to say that only 5% of the French foundations financing goes abroad, and most of it actually doesn't go to what we call our priority countries, but more to more developed countries where there is an interest also for French companies. So there's a real political will now to change this orientation, and AFD has a real role to play, a responsibility in order to bring these French foundations also closer to their partners of the global south, and to know them better and to work with them on the ground. AFD, I don't think there's any need for me to present you what we are. We are an old lady. We just celebrated our 85th birthday. I think we are the oldest development bank in the world. We finance more than 12 billion euros projects taking place in our partner countries. And I think the particularity is that these projects are originated by our partner countries, and most of them are implemented by our local partners. So the new strategic plan we are discussing now with our CEO is called Du côté des autres, by your side. So there's a whole change of narrative and method in order to be really close by the side of our local partners. In this respect, very recently, we have opened our financial instruments towards local actors, and in particularly, we have a dedicated instrument to finance NGOs, NGO facility, where we welcome the initiatives brought by the NGOs and finance them up to 200 million euros a year. So we opened this NGO facility to local NGOs, and we received last April a very big amount of projects proposed by NGOs coming from the global south, and that's the first response that shows that the needs are important and that they expect actors like we are. And then we, of course, already have a long history of collaboration with foundations, all type of foundations, the French foundations, but international foundations, corporate, the South foundations, on many issues, on all the sectors we're working in health, gender, education, biodiversity, etc. The idea is together, I think, to follow 2 main axes: support common strategic priorities, like we did last year on the Generation Equality Forum with the Channel, with the Chanel and the L'Oreal Foundation, or with the Gates Foundation. The Gates Foundation was yesterday in my office, and we had long discussions on what we can do in the South. We have also, of course, joint financing and implementation of development projects. And this is what is important also to say. We can directly fund foundations who will themselves implement international solidarity actions on the ground. We do a lot of parallel funding of NGOs, like we did with the Fondation de France after the earthquake in Haiti, after the explosion in Lebanon, and like we're doing now in Ukraine to help all the refugees coming from Ukraine. And we do now also more and more, and I think that's interesting, joint funding with foundations. We are starting to do this on the Southeast Asia Energy Transition Partnership with the CIFF Foundation. And with the IKEA Foundation in order to accelerate the energy transition in Southeastern Asian countries. And this is something we could replicate, I think, in many other geographies. So one of our most recent initiative, and we have discussed this with you, the Wings network, and we would like, of course, to further discuss it with all of you, is we have a financing now which is really dedicated to leverage private resources from French and local philanthropist organizations in order to support projects in developing countries. The idea is really to cooperate between a public development bank like we are, AFD, with a philanthropic actor and with a local NGO. And the three of us can build together an adapted solution to respond to local needs. We have started doing this, for instance, with the Sawiris Foundation and a French NGO called the SAMU Social to intervene in Egypt. So this is something we are discussing and putting on the table with the Wings, with the Fondation de France, and with all of you around this table who will be interested. Consider this as a direct call for proposals to all of you to collaborate and to exchange. I think we have a lot to put together in terms of best practices, of knowledge, of mapping, and there's so much to do. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really rich. That was a lot of different examples, and I guess I'm struck by the moment of this this workshop today that we've just heard three different agencies that are in the currency that they're now in the midst of trying to review. So the new By Your Side program, or your mention of you're right in the middle of changing for political will, like the new NGO facility. And then coming up with parallel funding. It's all new things that are being tested out. So I hope that Michelle or the USAID people can share perhaps their playbook internally between the actors, not with philanthropy or civil society, but between you all, to try to how you do those sweeping internal reviews and how you change how you do your business. I should mention as well that one of the next workshops that we're going to be doing at Wings we'll be looking at then philanthropy and how we have to change as well. So it's not just making a call to development agencies, but also trying to get our own house in order of what are the changes that are necessary to help try better to get the resources down to the local level. So thank you very much for those examples. That's very useful. And I think that'll be interesting to come back to it in our discussion. I want to switch now and ask for Bia's help. We had Ambassador Thomas Gass that was going to join us, but he was not able to. But he recorded a video, very short. Ambassador Thomas Gass is the Assistant Director General and the head of South Cooperation at the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, SDC. He has a unique perspective that he wanted to share because he was there from 2013 to 2017. He was the Assistant Secretary General in DESA, the Department of Economic and Social Affairs at the UN. So he had a frontline role in trying to frame the SDGs, and he has something to say a bit more about how it's worked out and where now as they appear to be faltering, he has a few comments on what would be the next solution or the way in which philanthropy and development agencies could work to address the faltering. So Bia, if you'd like to play that video now. Or Tiziano, if you want to share your screen. Do you have the video up?
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Thank you for inviting my input to this important discussion, and sorry for not being there in person. It is urgent to take a serious look at the how of development cooperation. That's why we're hosting the Effective Development Cooperation Summit here in Geneva in December. In this regard, I have 3 asks from you, and these are closely related to today's topic. We have all been driven by crises and emergencies lately. It was, and it had to be, about speed, mobilization and responsiveness. But we can't lower our guard in regard to climate action, creating local jobs, enhancing the resilience of food systems, strengthening governance and rule of law. Foundations and other philanthropic actors are often closer to the people than we administrations and public ODA providers are. That closeness gives you credibility. We're not copying out of our accountability to taxpayers, but we want to work with you to better explain the challenges faced by communities, to provide tangible narratives, and to explain the self-interest of rich countries to invest over proportionally in securing global public goods. In many developing countries, the COVID crisis has led us to work remotely. Concretely, that meant a withdrawal to capitals and headquarters and a re-centralization of funding via vertical mechanisms and line ministries, often weakening the fabric of community-based organizations that we have helped build over the years. Localizing development cooperation must reinvest into and build the capacity of these players, particularly if we want to see progress in the role of women in social cohesion and local peace processes. We need your expertise and experience in this regard. The SDGs will only become reality if local capacities and efforts are also mobilized. For this to happen, sustainable development must become a social contract between states and their people, between duty bearers and rights holders. As development partners, we need to keep asking whether our action improves that relationship and leads to a stronger accountability to the people. At SDC, we have made very positive experiences with budget support to local governments. I'm looking forward to your insight and to your contribution to a strong outcome of the December Effectiveness Summit.
Great. That's nice to have, even not here, but we hear a bit more about the sharing of experience and insights in terms of localization. And he also, just to make it a quick comment, was that he does mention the word accountability, stronger accountability, which we haven't heard mentioned yet, but that is one of the reasons of localization, is just to not be accountable to the donors or to not just the taxpayers, but also to those who are trying to benefit, those local organizations that should have that power to define how they're working and whether that money is being spent well is an accountability issue for the actual country and the people on the ground. I know I replaced Tony Pippa, who couldn't join us, so rather than trying to, this was a spot where Tony Pippa would share some of his insights, so instead I'd like to just start the discussion now. One of the things hopefully the conversation about the promises and problems of localization, and we can have a frank conversation about what has to change, both in development agencies or in philanthropy. So wanted to ask one of the first, to go a little bit deeper, I wanted to ask a first framing question of, do the participants here from development agencies or multilateral development banks, public development banks, do you see philanthropy as integral to that localization effort? And what is the value placed on philanthropy in that context? And does it vary from context? Perhaps there's region for region, there's a difference or a variation. So if so, or why not? And the second follow-up question would be more of, where is that value proposition then? If that is seen as a value, then what is the value proposition? Why do we think it's important? What exactly is going to be added by trying to promote a local culture of giving that would actually be able to create that ecosystem? What is the benefit of that? So I leave open the floor to see if there's any reactions initially to this idea of, are we in a general agreement that philanthropy is useful for that localization effort, and what is it? How does it vary from region to region in your experiences? I'm going to try to remove my own spotlight so that we can see everyone else. So let me turn. There we go. If no one is going to say anything, then or anyone with their hand up, I have to look and see. I would turn over back to actually one of our first speakers. If we go back to Reinier. Reinier, I know that it's quite a strong, as you said, a strong movement in your agency, in your work, to see philanthropy as part, and you're putting your money where your mouth is. What is the differences in contexts, the regional contexts? Have you seen a variation across the world in where that's going to work out and where it isn't?
Well, it's hard to say, I must admit, because we have focused recently more on the ring around Europe, so to say, in our development cooperation. And we lost sight a little bit of what's happening in Latin America and Asia, for that matter. So it's difficult to answer. I think when it gets to what contribution may we expect from philanthropy, it kind of faces the same challenge as a lot of INGOs face, having started from the north and then grew globally into a global presence. How do you anchor locally? And is that even a desire for the big foundations, for instance? And I think we have to diversify here as well, like the project we support, the Giving for Change Alliance, really focusing on domestic resource mobilization as a way to promote active citizenship. And I think that's where it really sits. And if it doesn't, if it is just for an additional foreign funding flow, then you have the same legitimate question that INGOs often have, or foreign agencies for that matter. So we've got to connect better to local communities and their priorities. And I think that's the task for all of us. Yeah.
And Chiara Adamo, he mentions also active citizenship or legitimacy. I think those were some of the things that you were saying about a pushback on democracy. So there's a link between democracy and localization.
Sorry, you're asking me again?
No, I was asking. I was just checking to see if we still have Chiara Adamo here, and if so, then that would be interesting to hear from her. I think she's out of the. Chiara? No, she's not here. The other question.
I pick up on this one as well in terms of, I mean, the relationship between the state and its citizen, just also alluded to by a Swiss colleague. I think is, of course, one that is severely challenged in many contexts, and it has to do with the history of the state as well as the state apparatus, like maybe originating from times of colonialism as an extractive force, so to say. How do you turn that, change that, undo that sort of structure of its exploitative nature and turn it towards an institution that really serves its citizen? And I think that's a much bigger question than that you can illustrate with very specific examples. But I think the examples we all know, they are out there. And therefore, it probably needs to start at community level as well, rather than at state level, because you build from the bottom up and develop good practice again around reconstructing that social contract.
Thank you. I think that there's a lot of discussion over fundamental things like citizenship or that social contract. In thinking about some of the examples as well, I know that we have a few USAID, well, Michelle Sumilis is not here, but we have a few USAID people as well. Would any of you like to step forward and try to talk about, in some of the situations like Cox's Bazar, which Michelle mentioned, or some of the other Latin Americans, perhaps we could ask one of the USAID people to talk more about what does that look like, that social contract of trying to help Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, in a third country, and trying to find how to localize who is the local actor that you want to empower and what the government thinks about that. Are there other USAID colleagues out there? I don't know you by name, so if you would raise your hand, if you want to say anything, then please do go ahead and use the function on reactions to raise your hand to see if that. And if not, then I'll give one more minute. I mean, I would turn back to some of the other, on the same issue. Patrick, Rob, I see you're from the EU, and we had one discussion about this a bit in Brussels before. Perhaps you could step in for the EU side and talk about what is that program that Chiara Adamo had mentioned in terms of the funding that is now being made and this idea of Team Europe. Patrick, would you, sorry to call upon you like a school teacher, but it'd be great to hear.
No worries.
As an EU, I know that you're quite well versed in all these issues. We'd love to hear from you.
Thank you. No, well, first of all, I think the question you put out to Chiara there was whether we thought that the localization agenda was important for democracy, and indeed we do. I think that's one of the key things we have. I was trying to look for it now in our policy paper, the exact formulation. But I mean, that's one of the reasons why we've emphasized going more local in this current financial framework, which started last year. So that's first of all. And then, I mean, what we're trying to do with this localization agenda is in some of the things that Chiara mentioned, so our support for democracy, human rights, our support for civil society organizations at the country level. We have our civil society thematic program, which to 75% is about country interventions. So that's clearly one big strand, and the strand that is important for Chiara, Marlene, and me, and Mathieu, and Giorgio are on the call. But then, I mean, the bulk of what we're doing is really in the country allocations from the general geographic programming that we do through the EU delegations and the work that they do in terms of working along harmonization, alignment, ownership with the countries in question, supporting their development strategies. And there, I think, is where really the mainstreaming of this localization agenda, mainstreaming support to the small organizations way out there in the areas where support is most needed is what is important. And maybe also a challenge. We're very used to working with governments. We're very used to working in capitals in the countries. And what we're struggling with is reaching out into the regions and into the local contexts. I don't know, Giorgio, if you want to come in and say something more on how we're also trying to link that up with local authorities' work, because indeed having a good connection between what we are trying to do via civil society organizations at the local level, and also in this context via all the philanthropy work that is being done, unless that is well connected with whatever local authorities are there in place, those interventions that we do or you do risk not being followed up or followed through over time. And so yeah, that's another kind of element that we're trying to build into this. But really mainstreaming this localization agenda into the regular big financing of the big donors, I think, is what is key. What we can do from the civil society democracy support front is good, but is sort of smaller than the regular financing.
I'm struck by that. Actually, thank you for your comments, because I think that in part I've heard other EU officials in the discussion of the OECD DAC recommendation say that the spirit is willing, but the bureaucracy is not. So trying to figure out how to smoothen or try to simplify that. And to Susie, I remember you were saying as well in your remarks that looking at some of the different things that were being done inside the organization to try to shrink the amount of hurdles that were being put forward. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Cassie. No, I wanted to come back on your first question, is to know what we can expect from philanthropists and how we can go on with you, and where your wings, I think, will be of very precious help. The fact is, we know there are philanthropists all over the world and in all the continents. Of course, for us, AFD, we are particularly close to our African partners, but there are philanthropists all over the world, and we don't really know them. So I think the mapping you are doing will be of a very precious help to understand where these actors are, what they do, what their needs are, how they work. So that will be the first point, I would say. And then to know how the flow circulation channels, how to know how the money comes to the projects, in particular money coming from the diaspora, for instance. How does it come locally, and how is it does it flow into the real concrete projects? And the last thing is to understand the constraints. Some of you have mentioned them. There are legal, administrative, all kinds of constraints that make it really difficult also to work with these local foundations, and for them to work locally, because sometimes their existence isn't even recognized on a legal point of view. So I think it's important that we have all these parameters in mind. And coming back to our example, in France, Benjamin knows the situation even better than I do, but the foundations are relatively small structures and not used to international cooperation. So it's something completely new for them. And this is where a public development bank like AFD or other structures, like, of course, like USAID or the Swiss Corporation, I think are very useful in order to help these foundations to get to know what their partners could be on the ground, and to orientate their financing to the projects that we believe are the most full of impact. So this kind of cooperation and the knowledge we all have to share, I think are two important points I just wanted to mention again.
Thank you. That's it's timely as well that you have not put a plug in yet, but the public development banks are gathering in October in Abidjan for the Financing in Common Summit. And that has been a topic that Wings has raised, is there's not a language, there's not a dialogue that's going on yet between public development banks and civil society, or if it is, the Africa Development Bank does one dialogue, the Asian Development Bank does another, but they're not really joined up or learning, sharing that experience. And it's also interesting to hear more about trust-based giving. So how to get that money down locally. Part of it is that trust-based giving that we've heard before. And finally, thank you to remind everyone that the constraints on civil society is part of the backdrop to this, as it's not just autocratization, but also, as the UN Special Rapporteur had put it in last month's report to the Human Rights Council, that there's a long-term effort to try to constrain the access to resources by civil society, so that money is not getting down there, because there's even more restrictions than there were before in the name of COVID or other fighting COVID, or trying to restrain or control how much money is going to civil society. Other reactions, or actually one thing I was going to ask Benjamin to speak up perhaps on behalf of Philanthropy, that thinking about and the Gates Foundation coming into your office and talking, maybe trying to figure out how does Philanthropy join up and try to talk to each other as well as how do we promote these continued conversations. Benjamin, go ahead.
Sure. I mean, I hear so much really insightful content that actually I want to hear more. And I know that we also have a few other development agencies and banks who are with us. So it would be great also to hear from them. I'll also share a few thoughts at the end, but I think very, very briefly for now, I feel like there are, of course, different levels of the discussion, but the needs are and the potential is absolutely tremendous. One aspect is, of course, partnerships, and how do we foster more multi-stakeholder partnerships, including philanthropy, including local philanthropy. And a lot of you are already doing it, but I think in most cases, it's like from one organization to another. But what's missing, I think, in most parts of the world are these platforms and these bridges that can structure this kind of collaboration beyond, you know, an individual agreement with an individual foundation. Because as it was reminded by Anne, most foundations are actually medium size or small size or even very small. And that's how do we harness that power, that collective power of philanthropy. And that's an issue on which we're committed to work on with the support of the EU as well, trying to see how we can help local networks create this kind of structured collaboration between government themselves, local international development agencies, etc. So that's one really important aspect. Another thing that I heard, which was really interesting, is how most of you are directly connecting the issue of partnering with philanthropy and supporting the growth and effectiveness of philanthropy locally with the question of civic space. I think that came up in many different presentations and remarks, and I think that's extremely critical. That's also the way we see it at Wings as a network trying to improve the environment for philanthropy. We really connect the two and say, on the one hand, we need to advocate, we need to create better regulations locally, and we're trying to support this kind of work, but there's a lot to be done, and there's a huge need for investments. It's very difficult for these, especially for local networks of foundations, for example, to get funding to do this kind of work of advocacy with their own governments. Because most of the foundations locally in emerging markets, in the global south, etc., they tend to be very focused on delivering direct impact around them because the needs are high and they're not as sophisticated. So like for them to pay for someone who is going to go to the capital city and advocate or write a policy paper or gather data for that, it's the least of their concern in many cases. So that's where we really need other actors to come in to help to show that this kind of role is needed, that it has an impact, and so that's also another aspect we're trying to work on. And we know development agencies can really play a role, and development banks can really play a role. So I mean, again, there is a lot to say. I'm glad to hear there is a strong interest on mapping the ecosystem, strengthening the ecosystem, which is, for us, the cross-cutting. That's literally the key to open all these doors, to create a stronger enabling environment, to stimulate the culture of giving, to build these platforms for partnership. So that takes an infrastructure, and the infrastructure for philanthropy locally is very underfunded, very, very underfunded. So again, that's another area where we know we need to work together. And it was great to hear actually a number of experiences from the European Union, from the USAID, from AFD, from the Netherlands and others, that really it's something you've started to do. So now the question is, how do we really scale it and create momentum and even maybe influence the frameworks? And I think it was good to hear CDC reminding the opportunity of the Effectiveness Summit or Casey talking about the Finance in Common Summit, etc. It's like we have these opportunities also to then influence the guidelines, influence the frameworks that are going to establish this kind of investments and partnerships, you know, as the norm in the development field. So just a few thoughts, Casey. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really helpful with the as a good summary of some of the points I've heard. I wanted to try one last question to throw it out. A question again, since this is a more private discussion between development agencies and both bilateral as well as multilateral development banks, how do you ask your development and agency colleagues to step back, let local actors take that lead, especially given the accountability issues or mechanisms, the need to report on money? I think we've touched on that before, of trying to loosen it up, or I'd use the word trust-based giving. I know here in the UN in New York, they're talking about trying to build more trust or more responsibility and local ownership in the plenaries at the high-level political forum. I was going to ask actually one of the USAID colleagues, Michelle's not here, but Catherine Tenney, I know you're here in New York with me and you've been listening to the same things that I have about leave no one behind and trying to build more trust. Catherine, how is USAID doing this? Because they've been at it for a while. They've tried over 10 years, I think. There's been programs before and new programs coming up.
Yeah, thanks, Casey. I think it's a really interesting framing to think about, like how we ask our colleagues to step back and make space for that. I think it's somewhat reframing our role as a development agency in that environment. So what does it look like for us as USAID in the field to support accountability and making sure that we're creating mutually beneficial feedback systems? How are we operating as a convener in that space? So instead of us being the main implementers of that work, how are we bringing together those local organizations and local voices to ensure that they're around the table and lend our convening power to help legitimize and draw attention to these convenings and really push for equality across how we're working with different locally led programs to be more inclusive. And so I think just if we're stepping back and kind of reframing that broader relationship and what we bring to the table as a donor, we have this opportunity to kind of set the stage for local voices to be heard and centralized and at the core of what we're doing. So those were a few points that came to mind.
Thanks. Yeah, that's, I should say as well that here in New York, as Andrew had mentioned as well, that not only we're hearing gloomy forecasts for the SDGs and a search for innovation, but not a lot of mention about philanthropy yet. So I think next year at the larger summit that they're going to do on the high level political forum, I think this conversation is a key one to continue and move forward. That is going to have to be part and parcel of the next high level political forum next year as they try to assess where is the innovation coming from, if not from the private sector or new ways of financing the trillions that need to be spent every year on achieving the SDGs. I think I would try to summarize. I think Benjamin did a very good job of trying to summarize what we've heard so far from the numbers counting, starting off from Michelle, of 50% of programs should be spent locally, 25% of all their resources, 50% of the programs should have a local voice in them, to some of the different concrete examples that were given by Renier and by Anne DeSoucy on what programs are actually moving forward. We've heard a little bit more also about standing in the middle of some of the playbooks or some of the ways in which that different agencies are trying to implement this or rethink their the political will, how to build it inside your own organizations. The question I had was, one of the desired outcomes of this workshop was also thinking about a collective momentum to continue to further discuss or exchange on the importance of building a local philanthropic ecosystem in support of local civil society. and whether or not that would be a question of how then are you going to try to continue this conversation? Is this a one-off, or would you like to continue further? So if anyone has anything to say about that as well, would you like to try once more to try to create some sort of momentum here? And I think in part, I would turn it back over to Benjamin if you'd like to say anything more about creating a momentum or continuing these discussions and trying to move forward. If no one's raising their hand or not. Anyone out there? Go ahead, Benjamin. Why don't you give a word of thanks and maybe think a bit more about what we do next. What's the next steps?
Sure, Casey. No, thank you. And I mean, once again, I think that was extremely interesting to listen to all of you. It was really great to see such a broad participation, because we wanted to have a small group to be able to create or start this kind of community that cares about localizing resources for local development, long-term development. And it's great to see that there's such momentum and such alignment at the policy level. We heard many different new laws and new strategies that that are now guiding your work, concrete experiences. So we feel like it's not the same as maybe just a couple of years ago when we started a little bit these kind of exchanges, where it was a rather new topic, this question on how it is possible to really strengthen local philanthropy and invest in this and structure the partnerships, etc. So that's really exciting to hear that, and we'd love to support you in keeping the exchange going. So that's up to you, obviously. But based on what I heard, I feel like there's a potential and there might be a need for you to keep sharing your learnings and your ideas. It was said, I think even USAID mentioned that they were going to share internally their own learning through around this journey, building philanthropy and giving locally. So if this kind of content could be shared among each other, among yourselves, that would be something fabulous. And if this is also something Wings can support in any way, bringing some expertise, bringing some convening capacity and any other function we can, any other role we can play, that would be great. So and why not also issuing a statement or issuing a kind of a paper that would show that there is a real political will and that there are also concrete practices that now the field is ready to turn this into a norm and a way to practice localization by also investing in localizing resources. So once again, I'd like to really thank all our amazing speakers. I think that would be thanks. I see Anne in the chat from AFD saying that she would be more than happy to continue the exchange. I mean, that was our impression. We will follow up with you by email. We'll see what kind of form that could take, but we will definitely be in touch with you following this meeting to hear your thoughts also on the kind of follow-up you would like to have. But thanks, Anne, already for sharing this. And so, yeah, I was just saying that we'll be here to support you. We also have some tools. We also have some tools to help strengthen local ecosystems that we've developed, mapping tools that help not only gather data about who is doing what in terms of building the philanthropic sector locally, but also a process that is participatory and that ultimately should lead to more ownership, more investments also of local actors into their own ecosystem. And so this is something we're happy to also keep exploring with all of you. So that would be my last thought. Let's keep sharing, let's keep exchanging. We saw that there is so much going on already. So I will really thank again our speakers. I'd like to thank particularly the European Union for allowing this work to happen. That's as Tiziano reminded, that's really thanks to this partnership and soon come this new framework partnership that we're able to play this role, to create these conversations and to learn together on the journey. So thankful to the European Union for that, and thankful to all of you for your interest, for your participation, your ideas, and looking forward to the next steps together. Thank you. And thank you, Casey, for the moderation.
thank you all of you for your contributions. I think that was really quite useful to have working level people in a discussion as well to try to exchange. So I'm hoping that a lot of the different ideas or the techniques that we've heard can continue to be discussed, perhaps even the background documents that can be shared between different actors. So thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you very much, Casey. Thank you very much to all the Wings
Yeah.
team.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.